Okay, so welcome to session 3 of the Virtual Investigative Interviewing Conference 2020. And I'm very pleased to be introducing Dr. Jane Goodman-Delahunty, who's going to be speaking about the 10 top principles of memory that every investigator should know. Jane is trained in both law and psychology and is a professor of forensic and legal psychology at Charles Sturt University in New South Wales, Australia. Jane has conducted extensive research and taught in the field of forensic psychology for over a decade, and she is also an active member of the New South Wales Civil and Administrative Tribunal. Her empirical and legal studies foster evidence-based decisions to promote social, procedural and distributive justice, and her research has been funded by the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group of the US Federal Bureau of Investigation, otherwise known as the FBI, and also the Australian Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse and the Australian Research Council. Jane has numerous publications to her name, including her most recent book, which examines the area of understanding sexual harassment and evidence-based approaches to forensic practice. So Jane, I'm delighted to welcome you to present at the conference for us today on such a fundamental aspect of investigative interviewing.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Harriet, and welcome to all of the investigators. It's a great pleasure to have this chance to talk to you about memory processes and how those interact with the kind of questioning that you might be contemplating. I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about some research that has been done recently about misconceptions that people have about memory processes, because it turns out that the kinds of models that we carry around in our own heads about memory can influence the way that we ask questions and what we expect our interviewees to be responding. And so knowing exactly whether our views are in line with what the research shows on memory operations is helpful. And I'm going to be talking about this study done by Akhtar and colleagues, but there are a number of other similar sorts of studies that have produced similar sorts of findings. So what they did here was they surveyed a group of people who are memory research experts, as well as police officers and members of the general lay public. And everybody was given the same survey, which had about 36 statements after some pre-testing about 5 discrete areas of memory processing. And what they found when they did principal components factor analysis on all the results of all of these responses is that there were 2 different memory systems that emerged. There was what they called the common sense view, a set of beliefs about how memory worked, and the expert scientific memory belief system. And the difference really was significant across 6 different factors, and I've listed those kinds of issues in purple there, so that you can see what the key misconceptions were. And I put them in purple so they don't look like the rest of the presentation slides, which are talking about accurate views of memory. You know, so very commonly people think that memory is continuous and includes everything and is also permanent, like a DVD recording. People tend to think that the more details somebody reports when they're describing an event, and especially if they're vivid, that they must have a more accurate and reliable memory than other individuals. People think that if you've had a very disturbing emotional experience, that you can repress it in your mind for years and then suddenly it can be recovered. But in fact, there's no evidence at all for memory repression. And so that was one area where lay views diverged. Also, people tend to think that if you've had a very intense experience or perhaps a traumatic one that leaves you with vivid imagery or vivid memory traces, that those must be accurate. But in fact, there's no correlation between vividness and accuracy. People generally hold the view, as does the law, that memory systematically fades with the passage of time. and that therefore, if you're trying to retrieve something that occurred further back in time rather than something more recent, that's going to be subject to forgetting. So we'll look at that question in more detail. And then finally, people tend to overbelieve the rate of false memories, but underbelieve where the errors occur. So people think that false memories are very common, especially of things like childhood sex abuse or other factors. And so we're going to delve carefully today into how errors occur and what their nature is. So this study was useful because it highlighted these core differences and misconceptions. And the problem is they can lead you to have very unrealistic expectations of what memory performance looks like when it is sincere and honest. And you may make then incorrect judgments about the credibility of someone. So what I've tried to focus on today is to just talk about functional aspects of memory. And I was very attracted to some work that was done by some Canadian researchers whose names are Ian Neath and Suprana. And so I am indebted to them today for these principles and for really enlightening me about functional issues. And I've listed there a set of really important questions that I think you might want to consider and sort of jot down your own answers as we look at them. Because I'm hoping that by the end of this presentation, you will have some definite answers to these questions and perhaps different ones than you have right now. So the first question to think about is what triggers memory, how people go about generating a coherent account or answer for their actions in the past, what questions you might ask that are more effective or less effective in terms of memory overload, what it is about certain memories that makes them stand out, whether the passage of time is responsible for causing forgetting, and I've given you a bit of a clue about that one already, why it seems so challenging for us to talk about and remember events that are repeated, you know, like what you had for breakfast the last month. Whether there are certain sorts of items or events that are inherently more memorable, like pictures. And if you're not familiar with the terms episodic or semantic memory right now, you will be shortly, but whether those processes are subject to any changes in the human lifespan, so that you might want to deal with older witnesses somewhat differently than younger witnesses. And then whether if you ask a question that is much more specific, you're going to get a better answer than if you ask a more general question. And finally, what it is that leads to those errors and what makes people more suggestible or susceptible to suggestions in some form from others. So those are the core issues that I'm trying to focus on today that are fundamental to the principles that I'm going to be talking about. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background about memory just to start out. So memory researchers have determined that although we tend to think of memory as some sort of unitary component set, in fact, it's comprised of a number of different, very distinct systems. And usually 5 are distinguished, and I've highlighted those 5 in color because the way they fit together and what the system names are is a little different. So the first one is just called procedural memory, and that is really the knowledge that you acquire in terms of learning to ride a bicycle or drive a car or perform a whole set of sequences in day-to-day life, which become routinized. And often unconscious, so that you don't have to think, very carefully about where to put your feet on the pedals or how to steer to stop yourself from losing your balance once you've learned the procedures. Then we have non-declarative or implicit memory, which is really not consciously recollected, and that is often about language systems or perceptual representations about forms and structures in the real world. It can also apply, though, to conditioned responses, so that if somebody, for example, has a great phobia, about the dark or about a specific individual or spiders or something, those are often conditioned responses, and they may no longer remember the source of them, but they are implicit in your memory system, so that when you encounter those things, you have a reaction. What we're focusing on today, though, is really what is called declarative or explicit memory, which has much more to do with knowledge or factual information. And usually that's broken down into 3 different components. We have your basic working memory, and that is really, for example, if I gave you my phone number, you'd have to rehearse it a bit in your working memory, or you would recall it into your working memory to repeat it to me. But that is not the major component we'll be focusing on. We're going to be focusing on episodic and semantic memory more than the others. So episodic memory is really your event memory for events in the past, and your semantic memory is rather different. It has to do with conceptual knowledge, and I'll talk about those in more detail next. Usually your autobiographical memory is a combination of your episodic and your semantic memory. And by the time you get to about 9 or 10 years of age, you have an autobiographical memory development that is similar to that of adults. Prior to that, it's not really very developed. And so you tend to rely a lot more on your episodic memory up to that age rather than your general knowledge, because you don't have very much yet. So in terms of how episodic and semantic memory work, it's important to know that episodic memory is very specific to times, places, and contexts. And it is your conscious awareness about those issues that is important in what we call the encoding experience. The semantic memory is sometimes also called gist memory, and that is gained indirectly, whereas the episodic is gained very directly, usually from the 5 senses. So your sense of touch, smell, taste, sound, etc., is key to the encoding of episodic memories and the direct acquisition of that information. Whereas your knowledge is often gained from other people, if it's conceptual rather than personally. Sometimes you're unconsciously learning things, and song lyrics are a good example of that, because you may not think you know them, but once the music starts, there you've got the lyrics in your mind. It is the set of information that endows the episodic events with meaning, and it is regarded as independent of any specific context or independent of personal relevance, because it's conceptual and abstract in nature. So what we have here are 2 fundamental systems, one which seems to be much more data-driven and one which is more abstract and concept-driven. And what we find when we look at people's memories, though, is that these 2 systems interact, and so that the content of any one particular memory is often arising from what an individual understands about an experience and how they interpret it, and that requires the interplay of both these conscious and unconscious factors, as well as the semantic and the episodic memory systems to interact. This is all important so that you can understand something a little bit more about the phases of memory before I get to the principles that I want to share with you. So we divide memory processing into 3 to 4 key stages. So the first one is really what is called the acquisition or encoding stage. And that is when you use those 5 senses to take on information from your environment. there's far more information available in the environment that you can actually acquire at any time. And so you're sampling from the environment. You don't have a continuous capacity to process it all. After information is acquired, first of all, into your short-term working memory, it has to be consolidated for storage. And so that process typically tends to take place most effectively during sleep, during slow wave sleep. And sometimes some dream research is showing, that dreams, in fact, reflect some of the processing operations. Nightmares, for example, sometimes seem to reflect that there's been some difficulty in processing or consolidating an information into long-term storage. And then the next phase is when you have to recall or retrieve the information that is consolidated. And we basically distinguish between two kinds of recall versus recognition. Recall is typically something that is done on self-initiation, and recognition is really indicating whether something has been seen before or heard before and is familiar. So certain kinds of memories, seem to be very well supported by recognition, such as taste and odor. If you know the story of Marcel Proust and how he started his novel called Remembrance of Things Past, you'll know that it was all stimulated by him eating a cookie that he'd eaten as a young child, a Madeleine. And as that taste was recognized when he was eating it as an older man, suddenly he was flooded with all of these childhood memories and started writing the book called Remembrance of Things Past. The retrieval process requires you to bring memories back into your conscious recollection, and then after that they become reconsolidated again. And there's some indication that sometimes the reconsolidation may actually be slightly different than the earlier consolidation. So turning to what the memory theorists have to say, there are some memory theorists who have argued that, in order to support memory information, you've really got to focus a lot on the systems. Others say, no, it's not so much those systems that I've distinguished, but the type of processing that is important. In other words, when you were experiencing something, did you give it full attention? Did you engage in what we call deep focus processing by attaching meaning to it at the time, or was it just incidental, superficial attention? And the difficulty with resolving whether these statements are correct is that there are some contrary data. So people clearly combine these systems and combine the processes when they're both encoding and retrieving memories. And so we can't assume that just one kind of memory test, will tap into one particular type of memory system, or that one kind of retrieval task will be the sole cue or method to get to a particular sort of memory process. And so what attracted me to the work of Neath and Supranant is that they try to look for consistencies across all of these memory systems and all of these memory processes, looking across short-term and long-term memories to try to see what there was about memory that they would call invariant general principles. And that will be what we're going to focus on for the rest of my talk with you. So they isolated 10, although I have to say that numbers 2, 3, and 4 are much more sub-qualifications and subparts of number 1. And so effectively, it's probably easier to remember 7 of them, even though they do distinguish all of them. And that fits well with working memory, because the capacity of our memory is usually about 7 items. So that's convenient, but that's just a list of the topics we're going to work through, because these are the principles that they have elicited out of all of this research. So moving on to the principles, and they're all named with a number. So the very first important principle is that memory is cue driven and very sensitive to the kinds of retrieval cues that are used in an interview. Some cues, might be sounds, images, emotions. They might be words. Mostly you're probably going to be words, but they could be nonverbal things such as items as well. And in certain kinds of memories, it's the sequencing of the cues that is really critical. So that's very true of procedural memory. You oftentimes don't really remember the next step until you've got the sequence in perfect alignment. And the major point to draw from this is that even if you're trying to tap into the same person's memory about the same kinds of critical events, there is always going to be the possibility that if you used a different cue, you might get different success in what is retrieved from memory. And so a great deal of research, as you might be familiar with, has focused on what are the cues that are more reliable in investigative interviewing. And you've probably learned that free recall questions are very different than cued recall questions or recognition type questions. So we'll look at a few of those as well. One correlate of the idea that memory is so cue sensitive is that if you use different cues, you might produce information that is a little different in terms of responsive memory searches to those particular cues. And that can make people look inconsistent at times, because sometimes a cue will produce a certain answer and another cue will produce a slightly different answer, or people talking to different people will describe an experience in different ways because those contexts are different. And so it's important to realize that inconsistency of that nature doesn't mean that the memory is unreliable. It simply means that it's responsive to these different cues. Now, the next corollary principle of number one is that the items in memory are not intrinsic mnemonic. So a mnemonic, for those of you who are not familiar with the technical definition, is something that is a memory aid that assists memory in working more effectively. There is some evidence that a copy or the exact item at encoding and then presented at retrieval is the best cue for that item. But using some very clever research procedures, researchers have shown that in fact that is not a truism. It might work in some situations, but not always. So for example, even with word studies, if you set up the context of the memory test and the context of the learning in different ways, and you showed people the word chair and then asked if they'd seen it again in a recognition test, they might not respond accurately depending on those other environmental features at the time. I think this is quite important in understanding why it is, for example, that facial recognition, of seeing the same person can sometimes fail. Also related as a corollary is the idea that it's not the memory process itself that is mnemonic in any nature. And so this is where that question about functional memory to do with photographs or pictures comes in. So you've probably heard, that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And if we look at the memory processing of images versus those of words, the question these researchers asked is whether there was something inherent about images that made them more memorable than words. And in fact, there are what we call picture superiority effects. But it turns out that they depend entirely on the kind of recognition test that you have. And so in certain situations, a picture is not going to be recognized and may not be the best cue compared to words. So it's not anything intrinsic about the form or the process of the form of an item that makes it memorable. And that's the takeaway principal message. The next one is very similar refinement to this notion about cues, and that is that cues themselves don't have intrinsic mnemonic properties. So you can't say that one kind of item or one kind of stimulus is inherently more memorable than another. What you have to do is take into account a much bigger spectrum of what the conditions were at encoding and what the conditions were at retrieval. And this principle was illustrated by varying all of those factors over and over again, just to see whether the rules stood up. And it's not the cue that makes the difference inherently. So that takes us on to the next general principle, which is that memory, in fact, depends on interactions, this dynamic relationship between the conditions at encoding and the conditions at retrieval. There have been some learning studies that have shown, for example, that people perform better on classroom tests if they do the learning and they do the exam, no matter what the topic is, in the identical room, because there's something about that specific environment that itself serves as an effective cue that helps to promote the recall subsequently because it's so close to what the situation was at the encoding time. The issue then about the memory prompt for you to consider, is does it require you to identify a specific context to get better information? And if you include a more general memory prompt or a more specific memory prompt, which works better? And this is where some of these free recall versus cued recall differences seem to play in. So we know that to engage in a free recall memory dump, sometimes it is called by researchers, that requires the individual who's responding to the question or performing the task to engage in a lot of self-initiated effort to search through their memory. There's not a lot of environmental support. If I said to you, what were you doing on the 10th of November in 2019, you would immediately understand the difficulty. And so generally, when people are able to retrieve something in response to a free recall question, and can do some sort of open-ended narrative recounting of what they have retrieved, that information tends to be very reliable, but it might not be very pertinent to the exact issue that you as an investigator are interested in. And so then you're going to be turning to some kind of cued recall that is a little more specific. And there are certain types of cued recall questions that work better than others. A lot of times they might be recognition type questions, or showing people, a photograph of someone, such as in a lineup or an in-person lineup as well, to see if they recognize something, so that you have a much more specific cue and a specific match. And the difficulty once we start producing these additional retrieval cues is that the error rate tends to go up. And so a great deal of research has been done on accuracy rates with these different kinds of processes. A little bit more just about the relationship between encoding and retrieval, some attributes of that to think about when you're asking questions. You want to know, was the encoding intentional or incidental? There have been some terrific studies showing how much people miss when they're attending to object A in a scene versus object B. The most famous of studies on that is about attentional blindness. If you Google that study using the phrase attentional blindness, you'll probably bring up the study about the fact that approximately half of the people who watched some people passing a ball and were charged with the task of attending to how many times the ball was passed actually missed seeing a 6-foot individual dressed in a gorilla suit weaving in and out of the individuals passing the ball, hence the phrase attentional blindness. And so a great number of things about where your attention is focused can influence exactly how much is encoded. If it's got more personal significance, it's usually encoded better than if you're just an observer or a bystander, for example. Then, is the retrieval of memory something that is just spontaneous, indirect, or is it directed? So if you were doing an interview, that's clearly in the directed category. Is the environmental support high or low? Really has to do more with the kind of context matching that I was speaking about with that example about study and learning. Sometimes people have been taken back to the scene where they encoded something to stimulate their memory, and that has been found to be very effective just because of the phenomenon called context reinstatement effects. If you have to do more self-initiated efforts to retrieve information or less, that might produce less information. So why this is important is that there are some age-related effects associated with encoding and retrieval that I'll talk about mostly at the end, but I'll just highlight the general principle now, which is that older adults, and by that I mean, typically from about age 65 and on, so it could be a bit younger for some, use their general knowledge or their semantic or their gist memory far more than they use contextually available specific cues when they are encoding and when the resources are low or the task is difficult. So the more complex the memory stimulus or the more complex the memory task, the more they're going to resort to semantic knowledge. Younger persons, on the other hand, are much more prone to rely on context-specific cues at the time of encoding as well as at the time of retrieval. So the age of the individual that you're working with can make a great difference to which kinds of cues are effective and what people recall based on those proclivities. Further, on the issue of the relationship between encoding and retrieval, I think it's really important, although I've indicated, that the issues about match and similarity play a role to highlight that what has come out of the studies is that if you simply match the cue and target, because you think that it's the similarity of the process that is performed at the time of encoding and the time of retrieval, that's to misunderstand the way the principle really works. So the findings are that if you have an exact match cue, that can fail in comparison with something which is more appropriate for retrieval. We also distinguish in memory research between what we call weak cues and strong cues. So for example, just with verbal memory, if I gave you the word blossom, you might readily associate that with the word flower. So the word blossom would be a very strong cue for the word flower. And leaf might not be. That might be a weak cue. And generally, when you have something that has a strong association, that does promote better retrieval. But there are circumstances where the weak cue that is available both at the encoding and at the retrieval time functions far more effectively than an exactly matched strong cue at simply the retrieval stage. So that highlights this principle's notion that there has to be the interaction between encoding and retrieval. So if you just focus on what you think is an association at retrieval, that wouldn't necessarily do it. Similarly, although depth of processing or the kind of meaning that we import due to our semantic knowledge to an event at encoding doesn't always predict stronger memory performance. There are situations where, in fact, that more superficial encoding is a better match for the task. So the focus here is the interaction and not any one of these other attributes like strength of cue or depth of processing. All right, so moving on now to the cue overload principle. This is very important because this draws on the notion of the interaction. And the issue here is that your prompt for somebody's memory is going to be less effective if it is very general and the number of items that could be responsive is large. So think of, for example, how many people do you know called John or Jane or whatever. And the idea is that if somebody has such a large set of potential responses in their memory system, it's going to be very difficult for them to retrieve something that is specific to your question, and they'll just be overloaded by all of these cues, all of the Janes and Johns, etc., and it'll be a muddle. So as you have more associations, then your memory performance is simply going to decline. Principle number 7 gets to one of those major misconceptions about memory and the models of memory and that DVD notion that was wrong, because memory is reconstructive. And this is really related to that question about how do people coherently produce information. And it's apparently a bit of a grab bag. So people use whatever is available to build a coherent memory. They will use information that was available at encoding. They will use information that is available at retrieval. They will combine it all. And the problem that results, because it's reconstructive and not an exact replica of an event, is that processing can lead to some distortions or sometimes, unintentional errors, confabulations we call them. And they're usually along the lines of what is most likely, because those memory systems will interact particularly with semantic memory about what seems plausible, what seems most likely. Another attribute of the reconstructive nature is that when you do retrieve memories at different times, they might vary even only slightly. So a useful analogy is the analogy here by Wexler, and others have written similar statements, that it's more like an improvisation musically, where every time you play a musical piece, it doesn't come out identically to the time you played it before. It might be extremely similar and reliable in its core features, but it's still somewhat similar. But it's definitely not like letters stored in a cabinet or unhung paintings in the basement of a museum. Those are sort of old analogies of memory, like a library system, which are inaccurate. So what are some of the important points associated with memory reconstructions? Well, sometimes we draw on information that is unrelated to the actual event to make sense of it, and that can be from our semantic memory. There are a couple of effects associated with this process that have been very well studied. We know, for example, that in terms of spatial representations, memory for the position of an object is not as accurate as memory for the item or the object itself. We know that in relation to a phenomenon called reality monitoring, which has to do with the veracity of whether something was a real experience or something that was just imagined, that if you have a very vivid imagination of an event and there was no initial underlying memory trace for it, you can persuade yourself that the imagined event was a real one. I've certainly found myself doing that, embarrassing as it can be. You know, where I had a very vivid picture in my mind of something I'd seen on film, and then later thought that I had experienced it live. Not true, but that was what I thought, at least for a while, till someone corrected me and told me it was impossible. So the imagination can be a very powerful distorter. A lot of work has been done on what we call misinformation effects, which is where you're given information that is incorrect about an event, and that becomes incorporated into your memory. The extent of that is somewhat exaggerated. In the literature, more recent studies, a mega-analysis, for example, showed that approximately 15 to 30% of people who are exposed to misinformation effects under lab conditions are susceptible to pick up that post-event information that can contaminate their initial memories. And usually it is more in peripheral details of the event rather than the core central details. You know, so it might be, you know, the color of someone's shirt that you're misled about, or the color of a car in a scene, if the central event features were occupying your attention, you would pick up that information if it were fed to you by an investigator in a question, for example. You know, Neath and Supranant, the researchers' work I'm talking about in general, have argued that using a word like false memory is really not helpful in talking about memory reconstruction, because all of it is reconstructive. And so, you know, it's to have the idea that memory is an absolute replica of truth is erroneous anyway. So let's not use that term, they would suggest. Right, now I'm getting down to the last few principles. So we've got 8, 9, and 10 to go. I had highlighted the issue about time and forgetting being critical. So what seems to come out of the research is that time is not the issue, but it is extrinsic factors that cause forgetting, such as interference. So forgetting, first of all, is a failure to remember, not a loss of information. It's not to do with the inherent features of the memory. So this notion in the law, for example, that you have a fixed record that slowly fades, that's a misconception. Don't think about it like that. What you need to understand is that the longer that an item is in memory does not make it harder to retrieve or more likely to be forgotten. Many autobiographical studies have shown this to be an error. Most lab studies are done, you know, within a time frame of about, 12 to 24 hours. And so they haven't really tested this issue as thoroughly, and this research on autobiographical memory has been more helpful, showing the durability. We also know that the phenomenon of what is called reminiscence undercuts that principle entirely, and that is that sometimes after you've gone to an interview, perhaps through what is sometimes referred to as spreading activation of synapses in the brain, more information percolates into conscious recall, and you remember new information that you couldn't retrieve in response to either a free recall or a cued recall question during an interview. And there's been a great deal of skepticism in the law about the veracity of those statements, but research by Fisher and others has shown that, in fact, in response to spontaneous reminiscences or free recall reminiscences, those subsequent recollections are extremely reliable and have correlations with accuracy in, when the ground truth is known, of around 0.94 or 0.96. So very important that the later recollections were in fact more reliable. We also know that interference with memory or producing forgetting can be both proactive when you're exposed to more, say, for example, similar information, or retrospective, due to, information that is learned earlier. So that's how the interference can be arising, because it's very difficult to distinguish that memory from others when there's that interference of other similar events or memories. I think I've made this next point. And the takeaway is that time and forgetting are not so highly correlated. With respect to short-term memory, however, I think there's more truth to it, and a lot of this comes out of what is called Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve, and that's only to do with the available details in your episodic working memory that last for approximately 24 to 48 hours. And you can see from the slope of that curve that it's pretty much like falling off a cliff. It's not a slow decline, but there's a tremendous loss of information that can't be regained or retrieved unless you've actually recorded it by taking notes or something else within that time period. That detail episodically is gone. Right, principle number 9 is called the relative distinctiveness principle. And what this has to do with is the extent to which something is really a standout. And the misconception here seems to be that something, should have stood out at the time of encoding. We've learned in crime memory studies, for example, about what has been called the weapon focus effect, where the weapon is regarded as standing out. That seems to be more an issue of where your attention is focused rather than the distinctiveness principle. So distinctiveness in memory research has to do with the time of retrieval. And if something stands out from other things at the time of retrieval, that is going to be more memorable. It is an isolated comparison, to the sea of other things that are in your memory. This is a very important issue practically, and it has a very paradoxical relation. So, and that is to do with whether you're talking about asking someone to remember an event that was a one-time only, one-off singular event, or whether they are being asked about a series of very similar events that took place in the past. And what we have learned is that once you have been exposed to what we call recurring events or repeated events, our memories function very differently than they do for a single event. For example, the Royal Commission was very perplexed by the fact that individuals who testified before them, who might have been, abused sexually, 100, 200, or even more times, seem to have a paucity of memory for those events compared to an individual who had had a single or one-off experience of abuse. And this perplexed them and in fact led them to ask us to look into these issues deeply. And what accounts for it is that when an event is experienced repeatedly, we produce a kind of a script for it, or what is called a memory template. And that captures the general repeated features of that event and sets up a set of expectations that we have about how routine events occur, whether it's eating breakfast or repeated abuse. And that creates what is a sort of a gist or abstracted memory for that event. And once you have a template in place, you no longer encode the details because you're relying on your script memory. And so the experience details become linked to the memory script and not to those episodic memory traces. And so you're unable, for example, to recall whether something happened, on the second time that you went to a restaurant versus the fourth time you went to the same restaurant, because you haven't retained in memory those detailed episodic traces. And then once you have a script in place, you tend to rely on the typicality or plausibility of that event. And so when you're recalling familiar routine practices, you talk about, well, we would have done this, or it would have worked like that, or probably such and such because that was the routine. And all you're accessing at that point is your semantic memory script for something rather than the episodic memory trace, which is much more impoverished there. So it's a kind of a shorthand that we use. Some people have said we do that because we're cognitive misers and we don't like to expend extra effort on events unless we have to. And this point is a little related to the last one, which has to do with specificity. So the principle of specificity says that the more a memory task requires very specific encoding details, the more vulnerable and fragile that memory will be to suggestion and to forgetting. And that's because those gist traces, those templates, those repeated experiences or semantic memories are far more robust because of the repetition than is a single one-time event that is highly specific. And so the interference potential, is greater with the specific memories. And this is where I wanted to elaborate a little bit more about older versus younger individuals. So older adults, for example, find it much more difficult to retrieve specific information in the following sort of order. So they're good, especially good at procedural memory or relearning, and recognition memory is good. Cued recall is quite good, but where they drop down is the free recall, or even remembering to write themselves a note to make themselves remember something. And so it turns out that the capacity to recall those very specific details is related to how much environmental support you have and how much you have to self-generate or self-initiate the memories. And those free recalls and so on require more self-generation. So the performance of older witnesses, if you're interviewing those, as I said, their episodic memory starts to decline from about age 60 to 65 years. They have what we call a dynamic shift, favoring their semantic memory. So they focus on gists, they focus on meaning, they don't focus on what we call verbatim episodic memory traces. That means they're not good at remembering names because there are no associations that are meaningful with just names. They're much worse on free recall, but they're okay or equivalent to younger people on recognition. So you might not want to, you might be perplexed if you ask them open-ended questions and their free recall is poor. This is the reason. They compensate for these deficits by sometimes drawing on their general knowledge and then mistaking the inferences for actual experiences. And so the error rate can go up, especially with longer gaps there. And that makes older people more likely than younger people to report that an imagined event was real, even though I think people have typically thought that that is a typical deficit of younger children. We've learned that, in fact, young children rely far more on their episodic memory because they don't have any real semantic memory of great stock to draw on. And so children's memory, up until the time when they have a good, well-developed semantic memory, is going to be a truer episodic trace and much more robust and resistant to the effects of inferencing about what is likely and what is probable. And that is called the reverse developmental effect. When you look back on your life and try to remember events from your earlier experiences, there are two critical time periods that I want to draw to your attention that are related. And then the first is that for early childhood, usually between birth and approximately 5 to 7 years of age, but in some individuals, even up to about 10 years of age, we have a blank. And that is called childhood amnesia. We don't, while we're children, we remember it very well. And even while we're, middle-aged, middle year, school year children or early adolescents, we might have good memory, but from adulthood, usually it's rare to have more than a few fragments of childhood memories. When you're asked to remember events, between the ages of 10 and 30, You remember those with clarity and detail better than any other period in your life. And so you hope that you're interviewing people about the period between 10 and 30 years of age, because that is called the reminiscence bump. People's recall is excellent, and not as good before or after. And as I've highlighted, once you get to over 60 years of age, semantic memory takes over. All right, so, those were the questions that I hope you would answer now to yourself. I won't spend time on those. I've left for you there a few of the key references, mainly Serprenant and Neath. At this point, I think I'm out of my time, and so thank you for listening patiently to quite a theoretical talk. And I'm happy to answer any questions if you have now.
Thank you very much, Jane. That was a really, like you said, it was very theoretical, but it actually took that, what I hope took people's understanding of the intricacies of memories to kind of a new level, actually, because it is a very intricate combination of factors. And the more we research these issues, the clearer those the actual differences become. I'm rather saddened that as I get older, my memory is not going to be as good as it used to be, but I'm glad I enjoyed my youth. That hopefully viewers will think that too. Now, we do have one question. So if you wanted to have a look in the Q&A box at the bottom, and if anybody else had some questions for Jane, if they want to type them in the box, then Jane can.
All right. Should I read this aloud?
Yes, please.
Okay. Right. So the question says, can you explain the difference in memory for pre-internet people and post-internet people in their ability to recall? The differences in crystallized memory between older and younger people, and how young internet savvy people have a greater ability to navigate and search for memory, as opposed to older people who have a well-developed crystallized memory and recall. I would hope that some of what I've addressed in terms of the difference, in terms of crystallized memory, maybe about semantic memory or general knowledge systems playing a greater role, might address that. I think that just in terms of working memory, if you have available tools, you learn to use those rather than rely on your memory. I mean, we see that a great deal in the classroom with students, who've grown up with calculators, who can't do mental arithmetic. Those processes just aren't rehearsed or learned, and they don't need to, because they're used to relying on not the internet in that case, but on calculators. And I think the same thing applies, in terms of sources of information. And so perhaps their semantic memories guide them to look for, specific details on the internet, but they're not trying to encode them and store them to the same extent as adults do. And so it is, in fact, probably a huge shift that happens just in terms of how we use our memory operations. Earlier, even in years and years gone by, historically, when people didn't have note-taking capacities and had to relate experiences via oral histories, they had to use a complex set of mnemonics to remember information and transmit it. And now there's no need for that, because everything is so accessible on the internet, and you do a Google search and you have to Google everything to answer questions. But we see this play out in many applied areas. For example, the courts are grappling with juries that want to use the internet to answer questions rather than rely on the evidence that has carefully been constructed, orally at trial. But I think it's a practice issue rather than, which has implications for what you store, rather than anything inherent.
Okay.
Next question. Is it fair to say it will always be better to produce exhibits to a witnessing interview, or to take them to a scene that is relevant? Well, if you have a chance for context reinstatement, I think it can have immense benefits depending on how good their recall is. I would say that the strict principles that I've just outlined would say that it's not always better, that there will be some, that it, as a general rule, those principles might apply, that giving people exhibits is going to be a good visual cue that will evoke, recognition or not. But to say it is always better would be incorrect in light of the principles I outlined, because there will be circumstances where they won't work.
Okay.
Next question was, are there any tips for investigators to use memory cues, their memory cues, to navigate through witness interviews? That's a great question about how to use your own memory. I think one of the most interesting ideas that I've seen to assist investigators become less note bound, for example, because where do you put your cues if you're putting them on notes, is the idea of having some sort of interactive system that you can use on an iPad or something like that, where you can rapidly bring things up in front of you that might be cues to navigate through the interview based on what the witness is saying, rather than looking, through a set of linear notes. So I think tools like that that might have all of the background information that can just readily be brought up, with an icon or something like that, might be a good advance for the future. Next question, is it correct, just going to pull this down a bit, when someone is trying to remember a memory or trying to create a story, that the eyes will look to a certain side? I can't answer that. It's not my area of expertise. So, I'm certainly familiar with the concept, but whether it is utterly reliable, I don't think I can answer, because I haven't stayed up to date on that literature and what else might be at play there. So best for me not to answer that one.
All right. Thank you very much, Jane. And I think in terms of that final question, there may be some answers to that in some of our subsequent presentations, maybe on Thursday, in regards to that. So look, Jane, I'd love to thank you very much for your time with that presentation today. And thank everybody for participating. I just want to remind people that our next presentation is on starts at 3 o'clock. And is a very practical session about interviewing children with regards to reportable conduct. So thank you very much, Jane. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, my pleasure.